Have you ever tried reading the Bible straight through?
Oh, yeah, that's a massive undertaking.
Right. Starting right from page 1.
Yeah.
Genesis.
A very beginning.
And you're reading along, getting completely immersed in the narrative. And for a huge chunk of the text, it's all about these incredibly strict laws.
Extremely specific rules.
Yeah. Complex dietary restrictions, highly specific animal sacrifices, and you get used to that rhythm.
You adjust to the paradigm.
Exactly. But then you turn a few pages into the New Testament, and suddenly those bedrock rules they seem to vanish entirely.
They really do. The whole framework shifts.
It's like theological whiplash. You can really feel like you missed a massive memo somewhere between the chapters.
For sure. This is a very common experience for anyone reading the text chronologically.
Well, if you have ever experienced that kind of disorientation, you are definitely not alone. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we have a really fascinating mission.
We do.
We are unpacking a specific theological framework that functions essentially as like a decoder ring for that exact feeling.
It really is a fascinating structural lens to apply to the text. We're exploring an essay today. It's titled Dispensationalism, a Basic Overview.
Written by Brother Woody Brahm.
Right. And our goal today isn't just to, skim the surface of his timeline. We want to deeply understand this specific method of viewing biblical history.
Because it's a very unique approach.
It is. Brahm argues that this framework is the absolute best way to recognize, organize, and confirm that God has dealt with mankind in fundamentally different ways at different times.
It's an attempt to find the underlying architecture of human history, as it's presented in the text anyway.
Exactly.
I mean, I think the word itself, dispensationalism.
It's a mouthful.
It really is. It sounds incredibly intimidating, like
Yeah.
a heavy, impenetrable piece of academic jargon that requires, a theology degree to even pronounce properly.
Right. It sounds very institutional.
But when you actually look at Broom's definition in the essay, it's very accessible. It's not just drawing a timeline on a whiteboard and arbitrarily dividing history up.
No, not at all. It's a theological method for recognizing distinct administrative changes.
Yeah, I like to think of it like a massive corporation going through drastic changes in management styles.
That's a great analogy.
Like operational protocols. When things shift, like the Israelites being required to offer animal sacrifices under Moses versus early Christians explicitly not needing to do that after the resurrection, Broom's framework argues those aren't just random inconsistencies.
They aren't mistakes in the text.
Right. They are highly structured, purposeful eras.
Exactly. And the overarching thesis of this essay, it frames all of these shifts in a way that completely reorients how you might normally read the text.
It's a huge perspective shift.
It really is. According to this framework, human history isn't just a random sequence of events, and it's not even primarily a rescue mission.
Which is how most people view it, right?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. But Brahm says it is essentially a 7-part legal demonstration.
A cosmic trial.
A cosmic trial designed to prove mankind's inherent nature across every conceivable circumstance. And ultimately, that serves to highlight the glory of God.
It's a sweeping narrative. I mean, it stretches from the initial creation all the way to a final, ultimate judgment.
It covers everything.
And it's worth noting up front, for you listening, you don't have to be a card-carrying dispensationalist to notice that the Bible has different eras.
Right. Most people recognize that the rules for Moses were different than the rules for the Apostle Paul.
Obviously. But Brahm outlines a very strict, highly structured view that brings a specific kind of clarity to that narrative. And before we even get to his actual timeline, he lays down 3 non-negotiable agreements.
The foundational pillars.
Yeah, 3 pillars that all dispensationalists share. And these are crucial because they set the rules of engagement for how we're going to read the rest of this essay.
They absolutely do.
So, the first pillar. This is all about how we handle prophecy. The rule is that unfulfilled Bible prophecy should be expected to be fulfilled in a literal way.
Because historic prophecies were fulfilled literally.
Right, exactly.
This is a massive point of divergence in biblical scholarship. It's the bedrock of this specific framework. When the text speaks of a future event, a coming kingdom, a physical judgment, or a literal return of a king, the dispensational lens takes it completely at face value.
No allegories.
Right. The logic is based on precedent. If an Old Testament prophecy about a specific empire falling or a specific historical figure emerging was fulfilled literally in the historical record,
Which Brom argues they were.
yes, then a prophecy about a future kingdom shouldn't suddenly be interpreted as merely allegorical or purely spiritual.
It demands consistency.
Exactly. If the past was literal, the future is literal.
Which leads directly into the second pillar, a hard, unyielding distinction between Israel and the church.
Another huge point.
Brom points out that within this framework, Israel and the church are two entirely separate entities. They have distinct programs, distinct purposes, and distinct futures.
They are not the same thing.
Right. The promises made to the physical, historical nation of Israel are expected to be fulfilled for that specific nation in a literal future millennial kingdom on earth.
And again, to understand the landscape, we have to recognize what this pushes against. Many theological systems argue for something called replacement theology.
Or covenant theology.
Right, which suggests that the modern church has essentially inherited or spiritually replaced Israel, absorbing all those ancient promises.
The Brom's essay explicitly rejects that.
Completely. In the dispensational view, God does not mix the two programs. The promises made to the physical descendants of Abraham regarding land and earthly governance, those are kept strictly separate from the spiritual promises made to the global church.
Okay, but the third pillar, this is the one that really stopped me in my tracks. This is a massive paradigm shift.
The anthropocentric shift?
Yes, we naturally tend to read history, and certainly religion, anthropocentrically. We put ourselves right in the center of the frame.
We assume it's all about us.
Exactly. We assume the entire story of the universe is exclusively about human salvation. But Brom states that God's ultimate purpose in the creation of mankind is actually to reveal the glory of God to all men and angels.
It's a staggering thought.
The salvation of mankind is categorized as merely one aspect, like a subplot of that greater objective.
It is a profound philosophical decentering of humanity. It forces you to look at the text through a completely different lens.
How so?
Well, if the primary plot of the entire universe is the demonstration of God's own attributes, his perfect justice, his infinite power, his unmerited grace to the entire cosmos, including the angelic realm, then human beings aren't the authors of the story.
We're the subjects.
We are the subjects of the demonstration. We are the variables in the cosmic experiment. This perspective completely changes the questions you ask when you're reading the text.
You stop asking, how does this rule benefit me?
Exactly. And you start asking, what does this specific scenario reveal about the nature of the creator?
Wow. Okay, so with those three pillars firmly in place, literal prophecy, a distinct Israel and church, and the ultimate goal of God's glory, we can look at the actual anatomy of a dispensation.
Let's do it.
Brom identifies 7 distinct eras. 5 are in the history books, the 6th is happening right now as you listen to this, and the 7th is still in the future.
Right.
But what actually constitutes an era, I was looking at Brom's checklist in the essay, and it frames God almost like a meticulous architect, setting up parameters for a stress test.
That's a very accurate way to put it.
He outlines 4 very specific ingredients that must be present for an era to qualify as a dispensation.
And those 4 ingredients are vital because they prove this isn't just about the passage of time. A dispensation is a specific relationship dynamic. It's a testing environment.
So what's the first ingredient?
The first is new revelation. God doesn't just quietly change the rules. He explicitly administers a new directive and establishes a new, clear standard for human behavior.
Okay, and that standard immediately becomes the second ingredient.
Right. The test. Mankind is given the responsibility to act as a steward of this new revelation.
Yeah, the third ingredient is crucial for the fairness of the trial, right? Time and assistance.
Yes. God gives humanity a sufficient amount of time and the necessary divine help to actually meet the standard.
So it's an unrigged game.
Completely unrigged. The opportunity for success is genuinely and robustly provided.
But because of human nature, this always leads to the fourth ingredient, judgment. There is an inevitable documented punishment when mankind fails to meet the standard of that specific era.
Revelation, test, time, and judgment. It's a cycle.
A repeating cycle.
And Brum doesn't bury the lead on the outcome of these cycles. He states plainly that these dispensations are progressive in nature. They are building a massive evidentiary file leading up to a final judgment.
So they are a 7-fold demonstration of the inherent sinfulness of mankind.
Precisely. The goal of this framework is to prove the guilt of the human race beyond any shadow of a doubt under every possible set of variables.
So as you are listening, I want you to keep that 4-part checklist, revelation, test, time, and judgment, in your mind as we walk through these 7 eras.
Keep it handy.
It's like watching a grand scientific experiment run 7 different times, tweaking the environment just a bit each time to see if the human behavioral results ever change.
Let's head to the starting line.
Dispensation number 1, the dispensation of innocence. This covers the events of Genesis chapters 1 through 3.
The very beginning.
The setup here is a completely unblemished environment. We are at the dawn of creation. The text describes an absolutely perfect reality where mankind exists with 0 guilt.
0 historical baggage.
And 0 ingrained trauma.
It is a state of being that is almost impossible for our modern minds to fully conceptualize.
It really is. We are so accustomed to navigating a world filled with moral gray areas, internal conflicts, and societal pressures.
But the concept of a clean slate here is absolute. Man began with perfect innocence. Furthermore, the environment itself was completely supportive.
The Garden of Eden.
Right. The duties assigned to humanity were incredibly reasonable and entirely aligned with their nature. Brome notes, they were tasked with tending to a perfect garden, exercising intellect to name the animals, multiplying and subduing the earth.
It was a life of unclouded communion with the Creator.
Yeah.
It essentially sounds like a flawless, productive existence.
It was.
So what was the test? How do you test a perfect being in a perfect environment?
Brome points out that the basic test was merely to obey God while living in this direct, unhindered fellowship.
They had total freedom to enjoy all the abundance of the garden.
With only one single negative constraint. They could not eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
Just one rule.
Just one. And that specific tree, according to the text, was the mechanism for obtaining a conscience.
When you lay this out against the 4 ingredients, the sheer simplicity is staggering.
It is.
The revelation is unmistakable. The test is as minimal as logically possible. Just avoid one specific item in a garden of total abundance.
And they had the assistance of perfect daily fellowship with God, plus a pristine environment free from any negative external pressures or societal corruption.
Yet the text tells us that man was tempted and failed the test. They chose to disobey the single constraint and ate the forbidden fruit.
It is the ultimate catastrophic unforced error.
They had everything and risked it for the one thing denied to them. So we have the revelation, the incredibly simple test, the monumental failure, and now comes the 4th ingredient, the judgment.
Right.
Brome details that God demonstrated man's sudden sinfulness through a series of severe judgments. This included the terrifying introduction of death, both physical and spiritual.
It meant the immediate loss of that perfect communion with God.
Physical banishment from the secure environment of the garden, the harsh new reality of having to toil against a cursed earth just to survive.
And pain in childbirth. It created a massive, unbridgeable gulf between man and the divine.
And this brings up what I think is the most profound legal and theological insight in Brome's entire essay.
I know exactly the quote you're talking about.
He writes, "This failure was the only one necessary to condemn us. The following dispensations validate the accuracy of the original test."
Think about the weight of that statement.
It's heavy.
In a legal context, the verdict was definitively rendered right there in Eden. Humanity proved that even starting with an absolute advantage, no prior sin nature, perfect health, a flawless environment, and the simplest possible rule, we will still inevitably choose rebellion.
So the next 6 dispensations aren't a series of second chances to somehow earn our innocence back.
No, not at all. They are an exhaustive appeals process. They serve to repeatedly confirm that the original guilty verdict was completely accurate.
That framing fundamentally alters how you read the rest of the historical narrative. It changes the Bible from a story of humanity striving to get back to the garden into a prolonged, airtight legal demonstration proving that we can't get back.
No matter how the variables are adjusted.
Wow. So with the innocent state permanently lost, mankind is banished into the harsh wilderness of reality. And this launches us directly into dispensation number 2.
The dispensation of conscience.
We are now looking at the time frame spanning from the fall in Genesis chapter 3 all the way up to the flood in Genesis chapter 8.
Right. Mankind is navigating a new fallen existence outside the protective borders of Eden. And the fundamental shift here is internal.
Because they ate from that specific tree.
Exactly. They acquired the knowledge of good and evil. They now possess an internal moral compass. They have a conscience.
And what's fascinating about this era is the new standard. Brome points out that God didn't immediately hand down a massive book of laws.
There was no external legal code.
The test was incredibly straightforward. Utilize that newly acquired conscience. The expectation was simply that mankind would choose to do good rather than evil, relying entirely on their own internal sense of morality.
God is revealed in this era as a judge, and the concept of sacrifice is introduced, but the day-to-day operating manual is just, let your conscience be your guide.
This is where the dispensational framework directly challenges a lot of modern philosophical assumptions.
It absolutely does. If you look at the thinkers of the Enlightenment, or even just common modern sentiment, there is a pervasive romanticism about human nature.
The idea of the noble savage.
Right. Or the belief that if you strip away oppressive societal laws and just let people listen to their hearts, humanity will naturally default toward peace, empathy, and collective harmony.
But this era is the ultimate test of that specific philosophy.
And according to the text, the results were an absolute nightmare.
The essay highlights that as time advanced across several generations, evil choices didn't just happen occasionally. They became habitual.
Mankind became so thoroughly depraved, so violently corrupt, that it became empirically clear that living by conscience alone does not result in a utopian moral society.
Left to our own internal devices, the result is overwhelming, suffocating evil.
The failure was total and systemic. The text argues that the internal compass was fundamentally shattered by the original fall in Eden. It cannot be trusted as the sole arbiter of behavior.
Because it's broken.
Exactly. When humanity was left entirely to self-governance based on internal feelings of right and wrong, they descended into absolute moral anarchy.
Brom uses this era as a profound historical proof against the concept of inherent human goodness. The era of conscience was a catastrophic failure because the conscience itself was compromised.
Which brings us to the inevitable judgment.
Because the moral collapse was so universal and so deeply ingrained in the society, Brom notes that God punished mankind with a massive, catastrophic global flood.
The intent was to overwhelm and destroy the sinful race entirely, preserving only a tiny remnant, Noah and his family, within the ark.
It is a stark, terrifying reset. The experiment of relying on pure human conscience ends under miles of water.
And that complete devastation clears the board for dispensation number 3, the dispensation of human government.
We are now post-flood, covering the narrative in Genesis chapters 8 through 11. The survivors step off the ark into an empty world, and God introduces a completely new sociological concept.
Since the internal restraint of the conscience was proven to be hopelessly inadequate, God steps up the parameters. He institutes the idea of external societal restraint.
Humans governing one another. Brom refers to this as a logical step up from personal conscience.
The premise here is fascinating. If we can't govern ourselves from the inside, perhaps we can construct systems to govern each other from the outside.
We establish communal standards, we organize leadership structures, and we try to collectively manage our behavioral output.
Right, and Brom points out a very specific mechanism introduced here to anchor this new era, capital punishment.
God explicitly instructs mankind that whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed.
It's crucial to understand why this specific tool is the cornerstone of the human government era. In a world where violence had just completely overrun the earth prior to the flood, the ultimate deterrent is now placed directly into human hands.
God delegates the highest form of earthly justice to human societal structures.
The logic is that if the ultimate crime carries the ultimate, inescapable societal consequence, humanity might be able to curb its own destructive tendencies through mutual accountability.
And the fear of organized retribution.
Exactly. Alongside this, God gives a very clear logistical directive: multiply and spread out across the entire globe.
When you look at those instructions through a historical lens, they are remarkably practical.
Very logical.
Set up rudimentary courts, enforce the ultimate penalty for murder to deter violence, and explore and populate the globe to avoid dense pockets of corruption. It's a highly achievable mandate for a fresh start.
It's entirely within human capabilities.
But here's where the dispensational framework points out the tragic irony of human innovation. How quickly does human nature corrupt even the most logical systems?
Brom identifies the root cause of the failure in this era as unchecked pride and a unified, sinful disposition.
Instead of obeying the clear command to decentralize and spread out, the descendants of Noah consciously decided to do the exact opposite.
They recognized the power of centralized human organization, but they weaponized it. They grouped together in one location, on the plain of Shinar, with a specific goal: to make a name for themselves.
They embarked on building the Tower of Babel, a massive monument to human achievement and defiance.
It really is the ultimate act of corporate rebellion.
God says, use government to restrain evil and spread out to fill the earth. Humanity says, no, we are going to use the power of organization to centralize our authority, ignore your mandate, and build a monument that reaches into the heavens.
They took the very tool of societal organization that was designed to curb their pride and used it to orchestrate the most unified expression of pride in human history.
Which leads directly to the judgment for this era. And Brome points out the profound, almost poetic irony in how God handles this rebellion.
God doesn't destroy them with another flood.
No.
Instead, he targets the very mechanism of their unified defiance. The essay notes that God came down and confused their languages.
By instantly shattering their ability to communicate, he completely dismantled their capacity to cooperate on their monument.
And the consequence of this judgment, it organically forced them to do the exact thing they arrogantly refused to do.
And the exact thing God had originally commanded. They abandoned the city and scattered across the face of the earth.
It's brilliant. The punishment perfectly achieves the original directive while dismantling the rebellion.
Brome makes a really astute observation here. He notes that even though mankind spectacularly failed the tests for both the dispensation of conscience and human government millennia ago, we still rely heavily on both of these tools today.
To try and maintain order.
Yes. We still appeal to people's consciences, and we still build massive, complex governments. But this era serves as historical proof within this framework that neither internal feelings nor external legislation can fundamentally cure the underlying disease of the human heart.
Exactly. The first three dispensations dealt with humanity as a whole, and humanity as a whole repeatedly proved its depravity. So God shifts his strategy entirely.
We move into dispensation number 4, the dispensation of promise.
This covers the time frame from the call of Abraham in Genesis chapter 11 all the way to the bondage in Egypt culminating in Exodus chapter 18.
This represents a massive structural pivot in the biblical narrative.
A huge pivot. Up until this point, God has been dealing with the entire global population macroscopically. But now, God zooms in.
He decides to isolate his workings to one select group. He calls one man, Abram, later Abraham, out of a pagan culture, and makes him incredibly specific, unconditional promises.
God promises that a special, innumerable nation will be formed directly from his descendants. He promises them a unique geographical land of their own, profound blessings, and divine protection from their enemies.
The revelation in this era is deeply personal and highly localized. And the test, when compared to the complexity of human government, is beautifully simple.
Brome outlines it clearly. Believe the promises made by God, act on those promises, and physically stay within the boundaries of the promised land.
They weren't given a massive legal code yet. They were simply asked to live under the condition of trusting God's gracious word, willingly following his guidance, and gratefully accepting his physical provision in the land he designated for them.
I want to highlight a brilliant visual analogy that Brome uses for this era.
The pyramid.
Yes, the pyramid. He calls the dispensation of promise a pyramid. If you visualize it, it starts at the very top, the narrowest point, with one single person, Abraham.
But as time moves forward, the promises begin to materialize and the base gets wider and wider.
The text notes that they eventually entered the land as a small, vulnerable clan of about 70 people, but over time they multiplied into a massive, formidable nation of 600,000 men, plus women and children.
The pyramid grows exponentially.
But despite that undeniable, miraculous growth and the clear, repeated affirmations of God's promises, they still failed the test.
The essay meticulously points out that the disobedience of the patriarchs was vividly demonstrated by their recurring decisions to abandon the land God explicitly gave them.
Whenever a famine hit or hardship arose, instead of trusting that the God who promised them the land would sustain them within it, they consistently chose to rely on human reasoning.
They repeatedly relocated to Egypt to find relief.
They sought physical and economic security from a worldly, pagan empire instead of trusting the unseen provision of the God who made the covenant.
They traded the promise for immediate practicality. And what was the judgment for this systemic lack of faith?
Brome emphasizes that the whole world watched, and even to this day observes through the historical record, the failure of this isolated segment of mankind.
The judgment was incredibly severe. This massive, chosen nation, the wide base of the pyramid, ended up enduring 400 years of brutal, dehumanizing slavery in the very nation they fled to for security, Egypt.
If we step back and connect this to the overarching thesis of the cosmic trial, it's a crucial data point.
We've watched humanity fail when placed in perfect innocence.
We watch them fail under the unwritten guidance of conscience.
We watch them fail when given the authority of self-government.
Now, God isolates a specific family line, gives them direct, unconditional promises of divine blessing, and they still fail by refusing to trust him and abandoning the land of promise.
The human condition, it seems, remains stubbornly unchanged regardless of the advantages provided.
Which perfectly sets the stage for what is arguably the most famous era in the Old Testament.
Dispensation number 5, the dispensation of law. We are now moving from the dramatic events at Mount Sinai all the way through history to the death of Christ.
The setup here is incredibly cinematic and carries immense theological weight.
It truly does. God is continuing to work exclusively with this select segment of mankind, the physical nation of Israel.
The revelation begins with a spectacular display of divine power. God chooses Moses to serve as a human redeemer and miraculously rescues this enslaved nation from the grip of Egypt.
Through the 10 plagues and the parting of the Red Sea.
They are brought into the wilderness to the base of Mount Sinai, and here God reveals an entirely new operating system. The 10 Commandments, followed by an exhaustive, highly detailed law code containing over 600 specific regulations governing every aspect of life.
And Brum makes a really vital psychological point here regarding the test. The Israelites were not forced into this covenant against their will.
They had agency.
Having just been miraculously redeemed from slavery, they were free to make choices. When the Lord explicitly offered to provide them with this meticulous law, the text records that they promptly and enthusiastically agreed to it.
They essentially looked at this massive standard of absolute holiness and said, everything the Lord has spoken, we will do. They enthusiastically signed the contract.
The test was laid out in black and white. Perfectly followed God's comprehensive law.
This dispensation is unique in the sheer volume of specific rules, the rigidity of the behavioral boundaries, and the massive duration of the test.
To explain the dynamic of this era, Brum uses a powerful and poignant analogy. He compares the entire nation of Israel to a prodigal son.
Under the law, they were given countless chances to learn. They were allowed to experiment, over centuries, with the cycle of obeying and disobeying,
experiencing the promised blessings of compliance and the harsh curses of rebellion.
Brum likens it to how an immature child learns acceptable behavior from strict but loving parents.
They were given every possible tool for success. They had the continuous warnings of the prophets. They had the mediating system of the priesthood. They had the physical presence of the temple.
The text notes they were divinely, painstakingly taught about the severe sinfulness of man and the uncompromising holiness of God through millions of animal sacrifices.
But despite all of that intensive divine education and rigorous discipline, the historical record of the Old Testament is basically a tragic chronicle of their repeated systemic failures.
Like the prodigal son, they consistently traded the wisdom and the spiritual wealth of God's presence for the immediate idolatrous pleasures of the surrounding nations.
And the essay argues that this centuries-long cycle of rebellion led to a profound, calloused spiritual blindness.
They became so entrenched in their depravity, so focused on the external rituals rather than the heart of the law, that when the ultimate culmination of the law actually arrived, their prophesied king, the Messiah, they completely failed to recognize him.
The ultimate catastrophic failure of this massive dispensation was the rejection and crucifixion of Jesus Christ.
The very people entrusted with the law executed the author of it.
The judgment for this era is multifaceted and historically devastating. The text explains that the theological dispensation of the law effectively ended with the tearing of the temple curtain from top to bottom at the precise moment of Christ's death.
This symbolized the definitive end of that specific, restricted system of access to God.
But the brutal historical judgment followed shortly after. In AD 70, the physical temple was completely annihilated by the Roman Empire, Jerusalem was destroyed, and the Jewish nation was violently dispersed throughout the entire world.
The era of the law, despite its crystal-clear boundaries and rigorous demands for holiness, ended in catastrophic, undeniable failure.
This brings us to a monumental shift in the biblical timeline, and it's a shift that directly impacts the listener. We are now crossing the line from ancient history into our present reality.
Dispensation number 6, the Dispensation of Grace.
This era covers the extended period from the resurrection of Christ and the empowering events of Acts chapter 2, stretching all the way forward to the future events described in Revelation chapter 19.
This is exactly where you and I are living right now, according to this framework.
Brougham explains that following Christ's resurrection, God executes another massive pivot. He shifts his primary focus away from dealing exclusively with one specific physical nation and goes back to calling people from the global population at large.
Encompassing both Jew and Gentile equally. He begins choosing individuals from every race, language, and background to form an entirely new spiritual entity, the church.
The word church in this context literally translates to the called out ones. It implies a group specifically separated from the world system.
And Brahm draws a fascinating contrasting visual back to the dispensation of promise. Remember the pyramid analogy for Abraham?
Yes, starting with one man at the top and expanding downward to multiply into millions.
Brahm says the current dispensation of grace operates in the exact opposite way. It operates like a funnel.
I thought that was such a compelling visual tool to understand the modern era. Think about the physics of a funnel. It's wide at the top, it gathers material from all over, but it requires pressure, and its entire purpose is to narrow everything down to a single point.
What does that mean for how the church operates today?
It means that instead of starting with one man and expanding into a massive, diverse earthly nation, God is currently gathering millions of diverse, flawed people from all over the globe and funneling them down.
Putting them under the pressure of sanctification to conform them all into the image of one single person, Jesus Christ.
The ultimate goal of this era isn't earthly expansion. It's spiritual reduction and absolute conformity to Christ's character.
So if that's the goal, what is the specific revelation and the test for this current era?
Rome states that the standard is initially to believe in the finished, miraculous accomplishments of the Savior, but it's significantly more than just mental assent to historical facts.
In this era, believers are granted an unprecedented advantage: the indwelling guidance and the spiritual gifts of the Holy Spirit.
The test, therefore, is to actually live by the power of that Spirit, to maintain a distinct separation from the corrupt value systems of the world, to actively spread the gospel message, and to live in genuine unity with other believers.
The author emphasizes a critical point here. The privileges afforded to humanity in this current era are astronomically higher than in any previous dispensation.
Believers possess the permanent presence of the Holy Spirit, providing internal enlightenment. We have the completed written word of God readily available.
Believers are spiritually baptized into Christ himself, forming what the text calls the body of Christ. Because this divine enablement is so profound, the test is deeply significant.
And God is allowing a massive amount of time, roughly 2,000 years so far, to patiently observe exactly how this specific demonstration progresses.
Okay, here is where the essay gets incredibly challenging and, frankly, very sobering. Remember, Brahm is evaluating history from a strict dispensational viewpoint, looking at the overarching behavioral trends of humanity.
So how are we doing with this test?
Brahm states plainly that as we look at the trajectory, crossing the line from history into prophecy, the ultimate result is absolutely certain: massive failure.
He pulls no punches in his diagnostic assessment of the modern church landscape. He observes that presently the visible church is fractured, deeply divided, and in many places actively regrouping into a worldwide compromised system.
He argues that even among the best of local congregations, many are blinded by watered-down doctrines that prioritize entertaining rituals over truth and increasingly allow blatantly sinful behaviors to be accepted or excused.
The radical, finished work of Christ on the cross is often neglected in favor of self-help philosophies.
Brahm attributes the systemic failure of the church to a deep-seated love for the things of this world and a surrender to the sinful desires of the flesh.
There is a fundamental failure to rely on the Spirit, and a catastrophic failure to remain distinct and separated from the world's culture.
He describes a prophetic scenario where a counterfeit, superficial church will thoroughly infiltrate and eventually overtake the weakened, true church in terms of global influence.
And the most tragic part, Brahm notes that a profound sense of denial has overtaken institutional Christianity. We look at our massive buildings and large crowds and think we are doing incredibly well.
But from God's perspective, quoting the diagnostic in Revelation chapter 3, the modern church is accurately described as wretched, pitiful, poor, blind, and naked.
It is a harsh, unflinching critique. Brahm is arguing a profound theological point. Despite having the ultimate, unparalleled privileged salvation offered purely by unearned grace, the internal presence of God himself, and the complete instruction manual in the Scriptures, humanity still inevitably gravitates toward corruption and self-reliance.
The true, faithful church will ultimately fail to spiritually transform the world at large, and the majority of mankind will instead rally around a false, deceptive, global leader, the Antichrist.
Brahm writes a haunting line summarizing this era. Failure does not seem to describe this situation adequately.
In his view, no words can fully capture the vastness of the disgraceful tenure of humanity when given absolute, unmerited grace.
So how does this current era, the dispensation of grace, actually conclude? What is the judgment that closes out our timeline?
Brom outlines a very specific dispensational prophetic sequence. First, the true church, the genuine called-out ones who remain faithful, will be abruptly removed from the earth via a supernatural event known as the rapture.
Following that sudden removal, the dispensation of grace officially closes out with a period of severe, concentrated divine judgment known as the tribulation, lasting exactly 7 years.
And we have to understand what the tribulation represents within this framework. It is not just a difficult time in history. It is the pouring out of God's wrath on a world that definitively rejected his ultimate offer of grace.
Brom describes it as a period that will violently and drastically alter the created world as we know it.
Almost all of mankind who choose to follow the Antichrist and reject the true God will be physically destroyed, with the exception of a specific remnant who realize the truth and become believers during that terrifying 7-year span.
The apocalyptic judgments detailed in the book of Revelation serve to definitively confirm the complete failure of the church age and the unrelenting, hardened sinfulness of man when left to his own devices.
It is an incredibly heavy reality to sit with. You would think the destruction of the tribulation would be the end of the story.
And yet, there's one more era, the final test, dispensation number 7, the millennial kingdom.
This is the grand finale of human history, covering the time frame from the second coming of Christ to the great white throne judgment, as detailed in Revelation chapter 20.
This is God's absolute final dispensation for the human race on this current earth, and the setup is completely unlike anything before it.
Christ returns to earth physically, visibly, and in absolute power as king. He establishes a literal earthly kingdom and will reign globally from David's throne in Jerusalem for exactly 1,000 years.
Brum uses the biblical phrase with an iron scepter, which means Christ will enforce perfect righteousness, immediate justice, and absolute peace by managing the political and social affairs of men directly.
The parameters of this final era are just wild to think about. First of all, the judgments of the tribulation eliminated all the unrepentant unbelievers from the earth.
So this 1,000-year kingdom starts exclusively with individuals who have actively placed their faith in Christ.
But even more dramatic, Brom points out that Satan himself will be literally bound and locked in a prison referred to as the abyss.
He is completely removed from the board. There is zero external deception, zero demonic temptation, and zero spiritual warfare.
Furthermore, the physical environment is restored. The ancient curse on the earth is drastically diminished. The essay notes that agriculture will flourish and the length of human life will be vastly extended, echoing the days before the flood.
Death will become a rarity, occurring only as an immediate judgment for defiant sin.
Over the course of these 1,000 years of perfect peace, the original survivors will procreate, and the global population will grow exponentially into the billions.
Everyone alive will have direct, undeniable knowledge of the Lord's presence in Jerusalem. It is, for all intents and purposes, a literal, physical utopia on earth.
The test for humanity in this era is simple. Honor, obey, and genuinely worship Christ the King, who is physically present, ruling perfectly, and providing abundantly.
Now here is the ultimate theological mic drop of Brom's entire essay. This is the final, undeniable proof of human depravity. What exactly happens at the end of this 1,000-year perfect utopia?
Brom points out a critical theological reality.
No.
While the environment is perfect, the descendants of those original believers will still be born with a human nature, and they will still carry the latent, inherent sinfulness passed down from Adam.
For 1,000 years, because of the Iron Scepter rule, many of these billions of people will outwardly profess honor and offer lip service to Christ simply to avoid immediate punishment, but their internal hearts will remain unchanged and resentful of his absolute authority.
So, at the very end of the millennium, God deliberately releases Satan from the abyss for a short, specific time.
And what does mankind do? After an entire millennium of perfect global peace, perfect immediate justice, a perfect flourishing environment, and the literal physical presence of God reigning on earth, Brom says Satan effortlessly rallies a massive global rebellion.
A staggering portion of the human population immediately leaps at the chance to violently overthrow Christ's perfect rule.
This specific event is the absolute crux of the entire dispensational argument. It is the closing argument of the cosmic trial.
Brom writes, the point is that even under these near-perfect conditions, mankind as a whole will fail to meet the standard God has given.
It is the final, irrefutable proof. You can completely remove bad government. You can eradicate poverty and sickness. You can eliminate all external demonic temptation. You can even put God visibly on a throne in the capital city. And human beings will still harbor a nature that fundamentally desires to rebel against the Creator.
That is just staggering. The sinfulness and total depravity of man is thoroughly, exhaustively demonstrated beyond any possible counterargument.
So mankind fails the ultimate perfect test. What is the final judgment that closes the trial?
The global rebellion is swiftly and decisively crushed by divine fire falling from heaven. This catastrophic event leads directly to the Great White Throne Judgment.
This is the final, eternal condemnation for all individuals across all ages who rejected God's truth and relied on their own righteousness.
Following this ultimate verdict, the current heavens and earth, which have been thoroughly tainted by human sin and rebellion across all 7 of these eras, are completely destroyed, purged by fire.
Okay, we need to take a deep breath here and look at the massive, overarching picture of what we've just traversed. We've covered the entire timeline of human existence according to this model. Section 9, the verdict and the eternal state.
Why did God design the architecture of history this way? What was the fundamental point of these 7 distinct eras?
Brom synthesizes the entire millennia-spanning journey beautifully. The conclusion of these 7 dispensational demonstrations is to legally and historically prove that mankind is utterly, hopelessly sinful under all conceivable circumstances.
Think about the variables that were tested. Complete innocence, the internal restraint of conscience, the external restraint of human government, the clarity of divine promise, the strictness of absolute law, the unmerited favor of grace, and finally, a literal utopian kingdom.
Every single variable was isolated and tested.
Yeah.
And every single time, without exception, humanity collectively failed. The core problem, tracing all the way back to the failure in Eden, is not our environment, our education, or our government. It is our inherent, immutable, sinful nature.
Through this lens, God has been methodically demonstrating mankind's total depravity through the ages. By the time the millennial rebellion is crushed, there will be absolutely no room for humanity to stand before the Creator and say, well, if only you had given us better rules, or if only you had been more forgiving, or if only we had a perfect environment without temptation.
Every single one of those human excuses has been systematically dismantled by the empirical evidence of history itself.
And this brings us full circle back to the 3rd pillar we discussed at the very beginning of this deep dive. The ultimate purpose of this grand, sweeping narrative wasn't just to prove humanity guilty. The ultimate purpose was to reveal the glory of God.
Brom states that by the time the old world ends and eternity begins, God will have fully, comprehensively demonstrated His omnipotent power, His perfect omniscience, His unyielding righteousness, His absolute justice, and His infinite grace, all in perfect, harmonious balance.
The unapproachable glory of God becomes an indisputable, proven fact when you review His masterful administration through these 7 dispensations.
So what actually happens after the old heavens and earth are destroyed? What is the eternal state that follows the trial?
Brom explains that the natural, corrupted creation is entirely replaced by a completely new, unimaginable reality. God will make all things new.
The chosen ones, the redeemed who accepted God's grace, will enter into God's eternal kingdom, a reality that exists entirely apart from anything tainted or cursed by the fall of man.
And Brom notes some truly incredible theological details about this eternal state. Redeemed mankind will actually be exalted above the angels in the cosmic hierarchy and will actively reign with Christ forever.
The saints gathered from all the different historical dispensations will have specific honored roles in eternity, and the specific group of saints from our current dispensation of grace will collectively form the cherished body and bride of Christ.
However, the text is also uncompromisingly clear about the alternative reality. The fiery lake of burning sulfur will be the conscious, eternal abode for all those who stubbornly refused to believe God and rejected His gracious, unearned redemption plan.
It is the ultimate finality. The grand 7-part cosmic demonstration comes to a definitive end, along with the concept of time itself. It's a massive, awe-inspiring, and honestly, a deeply sobering view of existence.
We've covered a vast, sweeping expanse of history and prophecy today, tracing the meticulous steps from a perfect garden in Genesis to a perfect eternal city in Revelation, and dissecting the messy, revealing 7-stage trial of humanity that happens in between.
It really does provide an incredibly structured, logical way to digest the entire biblical narrative. It takes what often feels like disjointed stories and binds them into a single, cohesive legal argument.
And more importantly, it leaves us with something profound to consider about our own current reality and our place in the timeline.
Exactly. I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over as you go about your day. Brown's essay argues convincingly that we are currently living in the dispensation of grace. This is a unique era where the requirements for salvation are based entirely on unearned favor rather than strict adherence to laws.
We are given the highest possible spiritual privileges, the indwelling Holy Spirit and the completed Word. Yet, this entire dispensational framework predicts that our current era will inevitably end in the exact same catastrophic, systemic human failure as all the rest.
So look around at the world today. Look at the complex societal structures we build, the flawed ways we attempt to govern each other, the compromised state of the modern church, and human behavior at large.
Does the idea that humanity is inherently stubbornly prone to fail, regardless of how much grace, how much technology, or how much law we are given, does that change the way you view the daily news?
Does it change how you evaluate your community's progress, or even how much you trust your own internal moral compass? This framework aggressively challenges the modern narrative of inevitable human progress and forces us to look entirely outside of ourselves for any hope of a permanent solution.
It's a heavy, challenging question, but it's a necessary one if we're going to honestly engage with the depth of this text.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Woody Braun's dispensational framework. We hope it gave you a powerful new lens to view the grand, overarching narrative of history. Keep questioning, keep exploring the source material, and we'll see you next time.